Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. I want to make sure we honor everyone's time. All right. Thank you all so much for joining us here in Anacortes at the Northwest Educational Service District. My name is Sinead Fitzpatrick-Ploggy, and I am one of the co-leads with the Career Connect Northwest, which is hosted out of the Educational Service District. And I'm here with my other two co-leads, and I'll be introducing them in just a moment. But I want to go over today's agenda with you. So I'm doing the welcome. And we're going to do a little bit of, I'm actually, because there's so many of us, I want to just kind of do a shout out to see who's in the room. But we're going to, today, what you can expect to hear about is registered apprenticeships, what it is, what does it look like in our state, what does it look like in practice. We'll have a short break, and then we'll have a good return to learn more about the pre-apprenticeship program and then the program builder, and we'll have an opportunity to ask questions. So I want to make sure that we have over 60 muffins that were brought in from the store. And I was telling a group, you know, your exit ticket today will be leaving with a muffin, because I cannot have those at home. It'll be dangerous for all of us. So anyways, like I said, my name is Sinead, and I want to make sure that I call out our team members who helped to put this event together. So first, my co-lead, so Jenny Veltri. Yay. Woo! And then Alyssa Jackson, she's with Homish STEM and also one of our co-leads. So woo woo, my partner in crime. We have 3 career-connected learning specialists. So we have Donovan Tate. Woo! Megan Bensing. Hey, girl. And then Mary Powers. Yes. 3 fantastic individuals doing great programming in our region. Just so grateful to have them on the team. And so now let's shift to you. So who do we have in the room today? So Economic Development Associations, raise your hand if you're associated. Woo, woo, awesome. Let's see, high school CTE directors. Woo, woo, all right, that's awesome. What about our worksite learning coordinators? Woo, all right. Secondary high school teachers. Union, woo, we love those. All right, anyone from, let's see, who else did I forget? Counselors, yes, high school counselors, love it. And then workforce development. And of course, yes, woo, and then community members. All right, great. So we have a really diverse group in the room. Just thrilled that we are all able to come together today to learn more. So with that, just want to share with you our goals. You know, we are a somewhat young network. We have been working together for the last 3 years. And so we wanted to share with you, because we are going through a strategic planning process, our goals. And so our goal is really to catalyze regional stakeholder partnerships, collaborations, and opportunities that work to increase equity and access to high wage, high demand occupations in our region, and support coherent career pathways and workforce readiness. Really looking at how do we connect our youth to seamlessly to post-secondary pathways and high wage, high opportunity careers. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jenny.
Thank you so much, Sinead. And I am going to turn it over to Alyssa, though I will be chatting with you momentarily. Alyssa.
Thanks for the handoff. All right, so we've introduced ourselves a few times and we have some new faces in the room. So we wanted to talk a little bit about what is Career Connect Washington and what is Career Connect Northwest. Well, Career Connect Northwest is one of 10 networks around the state. Most of them are housed at the Education Service District that serves that area. And together we work with a range of partners, including labor and industry, which is in the House, Washington STEM, elected officials, business and industry, community organizations, and many more. And overall, our goal is to increase the pipeline for future workforce, right? We know that we need students with 21st century skills, and that's going to take everyone to do that together. So for Career Connect Northwest, it's housed here at Education Service District 189, and it's co-led, co-directed with us, Snohomish STEM, which is housed at Economic Alliance, Snohomish County, down in Snohomish County. Together, we serve 35 school districts, including and tribal education compact schools, and roughly 16% of the Washington K-12 public schools are housed here in the Northwest District. So we make up a good chunk of the state. Collectively, we also have 9 higher ed institutions, and our key sectors or our key industries include healthcare, IT, construction, and manufacturing. So this is a very neat chart of how we all work perfectly together, exactly in these straight lines. As you can see, regional networks are at the top. We are the blue circle at the top, the blue circle at the bottom, our program intermediaries. These are often you find folk. So you might have programs, you might be engaged in career-connected learning, and together we all engage with education, both in K-12, higher ed, as well with labor and industry, employers, and government. And as I said, together, we are working to support a robust pipeline of future workforce. And why are we working together? Well, we know that by 2030, over 70% of family wage jobs in Washington state will require education beyond high school. So when we say education beyond high school, we mean any credentials beyond high school. So any post-secondary ed learning. So certificates, registered apprenticeships, 2-year, 4-year degrees, all of the above lead to high wage, high demand, family sustaining wages or careers. And we do this with cross-sector industry pathways systems, ecosystems. So that's what we're talking about today. One aspect is registered apprenticeships, which is crucial for our economic security. I think that's it. So I'm going to pass it off to Jenny. She's going to get into some of the data around why registered apprenticeships and construction.
Thank you, Melissa. All right, so we just want to be clear that the Career Connect Northwest network is really focused on opening up these pathways for our students and our workers in the area toward family wage, high demand careers. When we say that, when we're talking about family wage, that means a wage sufficient to raise a family. That is different than a living wage. So we really are looking for, so you will also hear it as high wage too, but we talk about a family wage career. And then we're also looking at high demand. So when our students get out into the workforce, that means that there are a lot of opportunity, though there's a lot of open positions for those jobs. We want to make sure that our students not only can earn that family wage to lift them potentially out of poverty, but also that there is a job for them to go into. So what careers in our region are family wage and high demand? Many of you already know this, but we want to make sure that we've got some shared understanding here. So how do we know that? Well, we work with our workforce councils in the region. We have 2 here in our 5-county region. One is the Northwest Workforce Council, and the other is Workforce Snohomish. They look at a lot of data, and they create plans. And within these plans, they identify what our family wage high demand opportunities are. They look at a lot of key indicators. They look at overall size of employment. They look at that sustaining wage. They look at advancement opportunities and also local training capacity. So within our workforce councils, they have determined again, there are lots of great opportunities, right? These are not the only ones, but these are definitely ones that we want to look out for. Aerospace, advanced manufacturing, construction, healthcare, and allied services. And then we also add computer science and IT into that as well. So how do you get into these pathways? How do students get careers? So the reason we're here today is to talk about registered apprenticeship. And for 2 of those in particular, apprenticeship is a fabulous way to enter into these career opportunities. So here is some data regarding construction. And I've highlighted the opportunities via apprenticeship. You can see 1 year out, we're looking at $90,000. Who here made $90,000 1 year out of their post-secondary credential? Oh, I got one in the back. That's it. We didn't. So this is really a fantastic opportunity for students who really like to work with their hands. Another one, precision production. Again, this goes into that advanced manufacturing piece. 1 year out, we're looking at around that $90,000 limit as well. So these really are fantastic opportunities for students, and something that we really want to make sure that folks are aware of, so that when you're talking with students or any worker who is looking to find their next career, these are some really great opportunities. And with that, I will take just a moment to recognize Rachel McAloon. There in the back. She is from the Washington State Labor Council and has, this was her brainchild and has put this all together and also brought the muffins. So we are so appreciative to Rachel. Thank you so much, Rachel, for all of your work on this. And I'm going to turn it over now to our friend Jordan Shepherd from the Washington State Department of Labor and Industries. And he is really going to open up all of our eyes to the opportunities with registered apprenticeships. So with that, Jordan, come on up.
I'll try to open eyes, but I can't give any promises. So, we'll take our best shot. I suspect Rob Bartell in the back there was the one that raised his hand about yeah. So Rob, just so you guys know, his group wasn't called out. He runs one of the local registered apprenticeship programs up here. So we do have a practitioner and subject matter expert in the house. One of the things I want to say before we get started, did I go the wrong way? Maybe. Keep going. There we go. All right. So I am not a particularly formal person. I have never had a desire to be a lecturer. So if you have questions, if you have comments, please just raise your hand. Typically I'd say shout them out, but we're using microphones today. So just let us know if you have a question, a comment, concern, etc., and we'll address them as we go. So with that being said, one of the things that I wanted to follow up on your introduction on is not only do apprenticeship graduates start with amazing wages, right, as we saw, they also don't come out with any debt. And that's a huge differentiation between the traditional academic setting and registered apprenticeship completers. And so 80% of our system right now is building and construction trades. I'm going to say that up front. And then off the top of my head, I'm going to say something like 10 to 15% would fall into the category of advanced manufacturing. And then we do have other industries like healthcare and IT and others. And we'll get into that a little bit later. But there are opportunities in apprenticeship that aren't just restricted to the building and construction trades or manufacturing, but that is where the majority of the opportunities are right now in our economy when it comes to apprenticeship. So first of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about what makes apprenticeship different. It starts with employment. And there are so many great ideas out there about new programs to start, educational programs, training programs, all those types of things. But if it's going to be an apprenticeship program, you actually have to start with employment slots. And so when we're talking about registered apprenticeship, it starts with the employer. And that's why registered apprenticeship is a collaboration between of industry and frequently organized labor, because organized labor represents the workers and industry employs them. And that's where that collaboration starts. And so when you're talking about registered apprenticeship and applying to a registered apprenticeship program, you're talking about applying for a job where you will be trained to do that job while you're working in the role as in an in-training capacity, right? So you're not talking about applying to college where there's a specific number of enrollments available. You're not talking about applying for an academic program. You're talking about applying for a highly competitive job. So if you're talking about a registered apprenticeship program, one of the ways to think about this is, if I'm applying against this room of people, I'm going to have to interview against all of you. our education will be measured. I might have to take an aptitude assessment, all of those types of things. And the program will say they have 3 slots. They're going to take the best 3 people available, right? And that is based on the economic conditions at the time. So every registered apprenticeship program would tell you, yes, we would like to take on more people, but if they don't have employment opportunities with their participating employers, they can't bring in more apprentices, right? And that's a fundamental difference. So the way that I talk about this frequently is traditional academic models are what I would refer to as a push system, right? Demand for that service of education is based on the individuals that want to enroll in it. So your customer in a traditional economic model is actually the student. In registered apprenticeship, the customer is the employer. The employer determines how many apprentices, or the employers determine how many apprentices there are and what the marketplace is for apprenticeship. And so that's one of the first things that I kind of wanted to level set, is that, we would love to grow apprenticeship overnight, but at the end of the day, that comes down to industry and employment opportunity and how much demand there is for skilled work. So successful apprentices are good employees. And this is something else that I think is really important. You saw the earnings outcomes, and I think I've got a slide in here. Right now, the median, or I should say in 2022, fiscal year 2022, the median apprenticeship completer in Washington made $94,000 a year. That exceeds the median bachelor's degree completer. That exceeds the median master's degree completer in Washington State, when last I saw those numbers as well. And one of the things to understand about that is that registered apprenticeship is not a pathway for people who wouldn't do well in college. It is not a lesser than pathway. It is a pathway for those of us that don't want to go the traditional route or would prefer to work in a skilled trade, right? So I think that's a really important distinction to make. There tends to be a misunderstanding, or maybe a little bit of a classism bias toward, traditional academic pursuits versus registered apprenticeship. And while yes, like there are absolute values to both, the registered apprenticeship pathway is not a lesser than pathway. And a lot of successful people that go through registered apprenticeship will go on to start their own company and become contractors and all those types of things, right? So there is also a pathway to the C-suite style of lifestyle for apprenticeship completers. When we're talking about what is registered apprenticeship in practice, the way that I always talk about this is, once again, it's kind of an inversion of the traditional academic model, in the sense that the majority of the learning takes place on the job site and in the workplace, as opposed to in the classroom. So in traditional academics, you spend most of your time in class with your instructor, your professor, whoever, and then you may do an internship as part of your academics, or you may do clinicals or an externship, or whatever we're going to label it, right? In registered apprenticeship, that ratio is flipped on its head in pretty dramatic fashion. So what we require is a minimum of 144 hours of, and I'm going to use air quotes here because it's not just in the classroom anymore. It's always been labs and classrooms, and now there is some remote delivery and self-paced online study in some programs. So 144 hours of that academic instruction to 2,000 hours of on-the-job training. And then finally, the wage progression is a huge piece of this. So apprentices are paid all throughout their apprenticeship. The vast majority of our programs offer living wages walking in the door. So while we talked a lot about completer figures, usually apprentices make somewhere between 50 and 70% of that figure starting out. So if you're saying that the completer after year one was, for this specific labor market, $100,000, just to make the math easy for me, they're going to walk in the door at somewhere between $50,000 and $70,000 a year in many cases, right? So that will increase over time as they become more competent in the trade or the occupation that they're learning. So that's a big piece of this, and programs will basically assess them along the way to make sure that they're progressing. And a lot of times that's a collaboration between the program and the employer. There we go. All right, so this is another thing that oftentimes is a little contentious. Who can run a registered apprenticeship program? So there's generally 3 categories of organizations that can operate a registered apprenticeship program, and that's because of the fact that registered apprenticeship is based on employment. So the first is an individual employer organization. So successful individual employer organizations are typically fairly large employers that already have maybe an in-house training program, and they want to convert that to a registered apprenticeship program, or they have HR. Basically, the ROI for apprenticeship happens when you start getting economies of scale, right? And so when we're talking about registered apprenticeship, if an individual employer is coming into this space, it's going to be expensive for them to stand up a registered apprenticeship program if they're doing it for 1 or 2 apprentices. That's why we see so many employers, the vast majority of employers that participate in registered apprenticeship in Washington are a part of what we call group programs. And so those group programs are run by 2 different types of organizations. One is employer associations, and the other is unions. And I'm talking about those separately, but a lot of times those are actually a collaboration between those 2 types of organizations. So employer associations, 501c3, 501c6 types of organizations that represent an industry or a subset of an industry. And the reason that those work as a operator of a registered apprenticeship program is that they already have built-in relationships with employers, right? And so they are essentially offering the registered apprenticeship as a service to their members in some cases. When it comes to unions, this is actually one of my mentor when I first started in this space said that the apprenticeship is the one place that business and labor can come together and have a productive conversation on a pretty consistent basis. And that's always stuck with me, right? Because for labor, it's about making sure that the people that they represent, their members, are as skilled as possible, and making sure that that the future of their union and their workers is strong, right? And for the businesses, of course, they want more productive, better trained, more skilled labor, because that helps them and their bottom line. So when I'm talking about registered apprenticeship in Washington right now, we do have both union and non-union programs in just about every industry that where there is union representation. We do have some areas in which I'll give you an example, like we have an IT program. There's not a whole lot of represented IT workers right now, right? So that's not a union program. In the building and construction trades, I don't know what the exact percentage breakdown is, but if I had to guess, I think we're probably 60 or 70% union, and then 30 or 40% non-union in terms of, a number of apprentices that are in each type of program. Does anyone have any questions? And I should talk about academic institutions or workforce associations. I got ahead of myself. So the reason that only those 3 types of organizations can sponsor a program comes back to employment. So we require that every single registered apprenticeship program be sponsored by a committee of employer and employee members, right? In a represented situation where we have a union involved, that means that 50% of that committee has to be union membership and representing the interests of the worker. And in a non-union setting, that means that that non-management members of that organization or that industry that are participating in the apprenticeship have to nominate other non-management members to basically represent employees. And this is all because registered apprenticeship was actually created, in the 20s or 30s, sorry, Fitzgerald Act. and it's part of the labor movement. So that's where all of that comes from. If an academic institution or a workforce organization wanted to try to take on running a registered apprenticeship program, the real barrier becomes liability for that organization. And I'm not a lawyer, nor do I sell insurance. But basically what a registered apprenticeship program does is it shares the responsibility for managing the apprentices with the employer. And so it is a very interconnected relationship. And so you would end up having contracts, and every well-run apprenticeship program that I'm aware of has insurance for it, liability insurance for their apprenticeship committee members in case the apprenticeship committee were to be sued by an unhappy apprentice or former apprentice. Apprentices have a lot of rights. Like I said, apprenticeship is born out of the labor movement. So while academic institutions do a great job of providing education, it is an awkward fit, and we don't have any academic or workforce institutions in Washington State that sponsor programs. Does anyone have any questions before I press on? I feel like I'm just motor mouthing all the way through this. All right. So going back to our theme of the way that I typically talk about this is middle and high skill, middle and high wage jobs. And obviously that's not terribly well defined. So here is what we are looking at from a legal standpoint. So this is pulled directly out of both the Code of Federal Regulations, and then it's also mirrored in Washington state law. So to be apprenticeable, an occupation has to involve the progressive attainment of manual, mechanical, or technical skills. Now, the way that we interpret that has changed over time. It has evolved. Like I said, we have IT. We have a pretty big IT program here in Washington State, so that fits into the technical category, right? There are occupations, though, that are not any of those things. And it's not that those jobs and those skill sets aren't valuable. It's that they don't really suit apprenticeship very well, because we cannot, as a system, gauge somebody's progress, right? So we have a number of high school counselors in here. I'm gonna pick on you for a minute. How would I be able to measure whether or not somebody is a competent high school counselor, right? It's very, very difficult. As where if I'm talking about, we'll go back to like the most classic possible example, we'll go back to the building and construction trades. I can tell whether or not a carpenter knows how to use a carpenter's square, right? Tell him to do something, give him a carpenter's square and a saw, and we'll figure out if he knows what's going on. So that's really the differentiation for registered apprenticeship and why those three words are in there, because apprentices have appeal rights. And so if a program were to say, no, you're not competent, we're actually going to go, L&I is going to go to the program and say, if the apprentice were to complain, we're going to do an investigation. And that's our role. 2,000 hours of on-the-job learning and 144 hours of RSI, like I said. I think the important thing here is that does not mean that we can take a less complex occupation and stretch it out to that duration. So it's the industry standard would be 2,000 hours. So I'm going to give you an example that I created a bit of a stir a couple of years ago. It's been more than a couple of years ago, I guess. But certified nursing assistant, CNA. So if I were to go to a CNA program right now, those are going to range on average between 4 and 6 weeks, even if it's not full-time instruction, right? I can't turn that into an apprenticeship because the industry standard for that occupation is between 4 and 6 weeks. That doesn't mean that the CNA occupation isn't valuable. It doesn't mean the industry doesn't need it. We're not making any kind of value judgment. We're simply going by the law. So when me or somebody from our team says, no, we can't apprentice that, this is what we're going off of. So we're not a one-size-fits-all solution. going back to, you have to have the employer engaged at the beginning, and then there, you know, some occupations are suitable for apprenticeship and some aren't. So if you're looking at expanding registered apprenticeship, those are typically the first two variables you have to solve for. Who's the employer and is the occupation apprentice? Supervise on-the-job learning. So along with the progressive attainment of skill and wages, the apprentice is supervised. One of the most common misnomers when talking to employers about apprenticeship is that supervised means that, like, I'm looking over the apprentice's shoulder the entire time. And that's not the case, right? The supervision can vary based on the industry. It can vary based on the occupation. It can vary based on the type of job setting that we're working in. And those are the types of things that you figure out when you're constructing the program. It does not mean that you're taking a full-time, fully qualified individual and standing them over the apprentice's shoulder for 4 years. That would be terrible for everyone, right? So frequently what will happen, I'll talk about my experience. So in the Air Force, we use apprenticeship to train aircraft mechanics. That's what I did. And so when we talk about supervision, when I first started out, my staff sergeant was there, like, showing me how to do everything. And, you know, this is where the fuse box is and all this kind of stuff, right? And after a little while, it's like, all right, Shep, that's what he would call me. I want you to go pop these fuses because we're going to work on this system. And then after a while, it'd be like, hey, we're going to work on this system, go prep the jet, right? And so what that supervision looked like changed as I got more competent. And then eventually when I became a staff sergeant, AKA a journey level worker in this setting, then I was doing the same thing with the guys that I supervised, right? So supervision, when we talk about it, is essential. It is a core part of registered apprenticeship, but it can actually vary based on the industry, the occupation, the job site, the job setting, and then also the individual apprentice. Like, some apprentices, you got to watch pretty carefully. I had a guy walk right into a jet one time, and I was like, oh man, I'm gonna have to keep my eyes on him. And I have another guy who, you know, he spent his entire life working on cars and he was great. And so it was the type of thing where I checked in on him, but I wasn't, you know, hey, this is a flat tip screwdriver, right? So it's got to be clearly identified and commonly recognized throughout an industry. This is a piece where we frequently will encounter questions about what I'd refer to as like hybridized occupations. One that I came across recently because of the focus on green jobs is I want to create a solar panel installer registered apprenticeship. And that sounds great, right? Except for who is a solar panel installer? Well, you got to have electrical skills, right? There's some mechanical skills in there. What are you installing the solar panels on matters. And so these are all parts of other existing occupations. And we would refer to this as a carve out. It's not a separate and distinct occupation. Basically, they're trying to create a lower level electrician that also does a handful of other things for a specialized thing. We can't turn that into a registered apprenticeship program. Does that mean that there can't be a training program that teaches somebody that? No, not that I'm aware of, right? You still have to follow electrical licensure. You'd still have to make sure that you're following other rules and laws, but that doesn't mean that I can turn that into a registered apprenticeship program because it utilizes skill sets of existing trades. I had a very similar conversation recently about windmills. This is a contractor that installs is the wrong word, constructs windmills, put it that way. Same type of dynamic. There's a whole bunch of different skill sets, and we in apprenticeship can't approve that as a unique skill set because it's essentially like they could hire an electrician and a we'll say like pipe fitter for the welding or whatever, that whoever is going to be doing that type of work, and just have multiple specialties that already exist as opposed to creating one new supposed specialty. And the problem with that is that if we decide to stop building windmills, what do those people do? Right? However, if I have an electrician and 3 other specialties there and we stop building windmills, they just go to another job site, right? And so that's why it's built that way in registered apprenticeship. It's not to keep anyone out or to make life difficult. It's because in the long run, that's actually going to be better for the worker and for industry, frankly, because that journey level card then means something. So talking about registered apprenticeship in Washington, like I said, the median annual earnings for a registered apprenticeship completer was $94,900 in 2022. The employment rate is 93%. And that, is really by virtue of the fact that apprenticeship starts with a job. You will see these numbers. One of the caveats I want to give right now is you will see these numbers directly fluctuate in correlation to the economic conditions. So we were at an all-time low in 2009 and 2010. And most apprenticeship programs graduate apprentices after either a 4 or 5 year apprenticeship. Sometimes, the 4 year stretches into 4.5 or 5, depending on work availability. And so you'll see our numbers fluctuate directly with the economy. And so the $7.80 per every dollar invested in registered apprenticeship, part of the reason that number is so high is there is almost no public investment in registered apprenticeship relative to the scale of the system. So registered apprenticeship, with 1 or 2 exceptions, is almost solely funded by a combination of industry and labor. There are a couple of programs that will charge a relatively small amount of tuition to the apprentice, but by and large, it is cost-free and it is not paid for by the taxpayers. It is paid for by industry because that's who benefits from it. And then I have to update these numbers. It turns out that we had a glitch. So the percentages are correct, but it was double counting apprentices that would transfer from one program to another, which is not uncommon. So I might start out as we'll say I started out as a laborer, right? I see that the electricians are over there constantly working in buildings that have the roof on them and it's warm and dry. I'm like, I want to go do that. That happens. And so what ended up happening is that our system was not correctly removing those duplicates. And so we had some double counting in there. So the percentages should be about right. The total number is actually, I think, right around 16,000 apprentices right now, which for the size of our state is still huge. If you're to control for per capita size of our state and the size of our apprenticeship system, we're one of the biggest. One of the things that I also want to say is we have, I believe, as of last year, the last time that we saw the data, we had the best female participation in registered apprenticeship anywhere in the country. And I know 13% relative to 50% of the population is not impressive. However, it is a question of getting more young women interested in getting into building construction, advanced manufacturing, those types of industries which actually utilize registered apprenticeship. And that's something we're actively working on with our programs. All right, so the agency that I work for, what's our role in all of this besides lecturing you all to death at a relatively early hour in the morning? So the way that I talk about this is that we're essentially the accreditation body for registered apprenticeship education and training, right? So colleges have to get accredited. In the case of registered apprenticeship, you have to get approved by us. And what that means is that we will do compliance reviews. We'll make sure that a new program coming forward is consistent with industry. We do technical reviews. We are a bit different in the sense that we work hand in hand with industry. So for example, when I saw one of our training coordinators here, I knew who he was, right? Like we do have a different relationship with industry than a lot of regulatory entities do. And part of that is because we have to ask them for their expertise when something new and different comes forward. And part of that is simply just, it's nice to have a better working relationship with people than always be the bad guy. And then, like I said, it's industry driven. So one of our big tasks is trying to maintain consistency. I'm responsible for our soon to be implemented. Soon is relative. I'm not totally sure when soon means, but we are going to have industry sector platforms, which, you know, public members can attend. It will, you know, you have to be basically in direct. Most of the members of the platforms that will vote will be directly involved in apprenticeship in some form or fashion, but it is a way for us to bring industry together, have them provide collective input. We had a similar structure very recently in the electrical industry, and it was great for figuring out some complicated issues that frankly the department didn't have good answers to. So I'm going to catch my breath for a second. Does anyone have any questions up to this point? Crickets. Okay. But do you have a question? No? Okay.
So how I can get on one of those industry implemented platforms?
So we have a listserv at the apprenticeship section. So you can just go to lni.wa.gov and go to the apprenticeship, and there's like a, I'll find the linked, but anyway, you just sign up for our listserv, and once it gets going, we will send out a blast when they're starting, when they're convening, all of those types of things. When the legislation was passed to form those, existing internal processes weren't taken into account, so we're having to do a rule change, which is why I'm not sure on the timeline of them actually being formed. So we're in the process of figuring out the logistics, but we absolutely have an apprenticeship listserv, and if anyone that wants that information, I'll make sure to provide it before we get out of here. Oh, in the back.
So on your LNI, where you list all of the apprenticeship programs, does that also identify which programs are able to receive financial aid funding, or is that something that you guys don't have that information on your website yet? If not, is that something you're hoping to have on there? I know it's a heavy loaded question, so
No, yeah,
sorry.
you're good. So when I was talking about LNI's role as kind of the accreditation body, this is actually why I describe it that way, because the only time that we really directly interface with apprentices in an official capacity is if there is an apprentice complaint that the program is unable to resolve, then it comes to us. So the best way to characterize LNI's role, and it's not, we will go out and, you know, talk about apprenticeship, we'll not only to groups like this, but also to, you know, high school kids. So there was a wave tour up here that I recently, one of my staff came up to. We are like at a system level as opposed to at an individual program level. And I think this is actually, I don't have a slide about this, but this is a good thing to talk about. So the financial aid landscape is really complicated, right? So programs are supposed to be eligible for GI Bill benefits. I'll just give you an example. However, it's supposed to be automatic, but it's not. And I discovered this when I was running a registered apprenticeship program, and I had a veteran come in and I was like, yeah, you should be able to do that. And it turned out that I had to go to the approval agency, and then they had to come do a site visit, right? And that one's supposed to be automatic. So when we're talking about registered apprenticeship programs, we've got 220 of them in the state right now. And I'm kind of giving you guys this framework so you kind of understand how varied it is. Well, some of those programs work with colleges, but many of them don't. Many of them don't charge tuition, but a couple of them might, and that will change eligibility, right? And then you layer on top of that the starting wage for an apprentice. For many of the programs will take them straight out of financial eligibility for supportive services, while others, they might qualify for it for half of their apprenticeship, for example. And when you overlay the fact that like the criteria around all of these different programs for individuals changes year to year, like it creates basically an untrackable web. So one of the things that we are working on is having our staff engage more locally and helping our programs understand what is generally available, you know, through like the workforce development system or the colleges, so that when they do have an apprentice that is struggling, they can refer them there. So that is something that we're working on, but just, hopefully I didn't fully dodge your question. Yeah, no problem. So does anyone else have any questions before I press? Okay. So one of the things that makes Washington unique, and I actually think one of the things that has made our system one of the healthiest in the country, if not the healthiest, is the fact that we still have a pseudo-regulatory apprenticeship council. And I say pseudo because technically the director of L&I can overrule a decision of the Washington State Apprenticeship and Training Council, but that has never happened. And I can't imagine that it will anytime soon. So right now, any decision made about registered apprenticeship is made by the 7 members of the Washington State Apprenticeship and Training Council. There's 3 members that represent business, 3 members that represent organized labor, and a public member who is currently from the community and technical college system, Kenna May. And so anytime a new program comes forward, anytime a program wants to make a change, whether we're talking new apprenticeship policy, et cetera, this body makes the decision. And one of the things that I'm gonna say right now is that has added a level of stability to apprenticeship decision policy and decision making in Washington that the rest of the country doesn't enjoy. In one of my previous roles, I got to travel around as a USDOL contractor, as a subject matter expert for the IT industry, right? So I got to go all over the place. And I had no idea because I started working in registered apprenticeship in Washington. I started going all over the place, even to other states that have, you know, very established systems with a lot of labor involvement. And man, we have it good. So the way that we're talked about in rule and law is that L&I is the administrative arm of the WSATC, because I can come up here and tell you how I interpret our rules and laws, and I can make a recommendation to WSATC, and they could just ultimately overrule the department entirely. And unless that decision is appealed to the director, that's what stands. Currently, we've got, that says 31. I think that's a little outdated. We keep adding more. I think we're up to about 34 members of our staff. For context, apprenticeship in Washington has grown so much that when I started with the department in 2014, we had 12. So we have almost tripled the size of our staff, and our system hasn't tripled in size, but it's about doubled in size in the last 10 years. And some of that is the fact that 10 years ago, it wasn't 80% building construction trades. It was like 95%, right? So the apprenticeship landscape in Washington is shifting. A lot of people feel like it's slowly, maybe. But at the end of the day, one of the things that we have a focus on is maintaining the quality of our system instead of just saying yes to everything. So finally, when we talk about Washington State and the rest of the nation, one of the things that I think is really important to understand is frequently educators hear about youth apprenticeship in Colorado, or we'll be talking about a program that's run by a community college in some other state. There's things taking place all over the country that we would not approve here. And that is for a whole host of reasons. I'm going to give you an example. I'm working on a teacher registered apprenticeship right now with the Washington Education Association. And it's like This is a really big deal. We're talking about getting into, and specifically for special education certified teachers, right? So I went to this conference in San Antonio, and it's all about teacher apprenticeship. All of the other programs in the state or in the country that were calling themselves an apprenticeship were basically taking existing college programs, letting the students continue to work as a paraeducator and calling it an apprenticeship once they graduated their college program. We would never approve that in Washington, right? So to compare and contrast, as of right now, and I'm going to say right now because we're in the planning stage, this WEA program, the prerequisite to come in is you have to have a bachelor's degree. And then we're getting you the teaching education on top of it while you work in the classroom as an educator throughout the course of your OJT. And you're hired on the front end as opposed to being a college student that may be employed and be called an apprentice. And that happens across a number of different industries. And we're always happy to have the conversation about, well, I heard that this is going on here. Why isn't that happening in Washington? But that's one specific example that I came across recently of like, that's not what our system is built to do. That's not what our stakeholders would not be okay with us approving things like that, right? Because that's really taking an existing program and kind of rebranding it. That's really not how registered apprenticeship is intended to operate. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah, and then we'll.
Instead of grabbing the mic, I grab my phone, and that is not going to work. Hold on. Here you go, Matt.
Thank you. Just what you just said about the Labor and Industries Council and that LNI is basically the administrative arm of that. Can you clarify that? Because I thought LNI is the administrative arm of the National Apprenticeship Act, and the council is just a support of that. So maybe you can just dive deeper into that.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a great question. So Washington is what's called a state apprenticeship agency, which means that the federal government has delegated authority to the state of Washington to operate the registered apprenticeship program in our state ourselves. Washington made the decision that the body that would be delegated to is the Washington State Apprenticeship and Training Council. So they are the ultimate deciding body. I'm going to be the first to say that like we have always enjoyed a good relationship with the WSATC. We have a very substantial role in determining what the policy looks like and how it needs to be implemented, what gets approved, what doesn't. But ultimately, it's their say. So the director of LNI can technically overrule a decision of the WSATC. But for all practical intents and purposes, the WSATC is the final decision-making authority in Washington, unless there was a very extreme case. But we staff registered apprenticeship and do the day-to-day work and policy stuff. Yeah.
How do you determine what types of jobs so for example, your teacher example, which I think is a great opportunity, obviously a high demand career. How did you determine that would be a good avenue for an apprenticeship and why I ask is I think there's a host of positions that we have a lack of qualified folks entering into, for example, finance. And so I just wonder, like, how do you make that determination? Do they come to you? And then I have a second question about are there public programs to offset wages for nonprofits or educational institutions that really want to do this but can't afford those like journeyman wages?
So I would generally say that our most successful projects come to us because it means that there's an employer behind it. So in the case of the teacher thing, WEA started this year before we started talking about the apprenticeship, they had started a residency program, which is another way to become a certified teacher. And they basically got to us through the governor's office. So the governor's office came to us and said, hey, we want you to go figure out how to do this thing. And so that was a directive. It just kind of depends on a case-by-case basis. Ultimately, when it comes down to any of these opportunities, it has to come from either industry or labor, or it is very, very hard to get it going. The number of times that I've worked on projects where we're trying to transform an academic program into registered apprenticeship and we just can't get it there is, I mean, it's a really, really high percentage, because taking something that's intended as an enrollment-based academic program and trying to move the employment to the front poses all sorts of challenges for all the parties involved. Your second question was, wage offsets. So we and the WSATC at this point have made the policy decision that we do not endorse and will not pursue those. And the reason for this is really simple. If you can't afford to pay an apprentice, you can't afford to pay a journey level worker. And our goal is not to have an apprentice and then them not be retained. The goal of this system is a fully qualified worker that stays with the employer that trained them, or stays in the industry in the case of a dispatch program, right? Building construction trades are a little bit different in the sense that, like, you might switch contractors if you're switching projects because you got done building the bridge, right? So no, we do not want to engage in behaviors that incentivize employers to pursue cheap labor. And I would also say that apprentices already earn a reduced wage than a journey level worker by virtue of that wage progression. And so while I do understand, you know, we have WIOA funding that has OJT money in there, and there are, I believe, ways to fit that into registered apprenticeship, as a policy, we don't want to create a situation where an employer is going to be incentivized not to retain their apprentice once they graduate and go get another apprentice who is going to cost them less money for that labor. So hopefully that answers your question. Yeah. Oh, here. I'm really close.
Can you speak to registered apprenticeships, how they feed into, recognized apprenticeships, the too many R's, into a registered apprenticeship? And then those of us who are sitting in the K-12 world, how do we help build those bridge pathways so our students thrive later?
So that's a great question. And I think we're going to spend the entire afternoon talking about prep. So prep is 100% like the best, I think, personal editorial. It's the best possible opportunity for high school students. Because, you know, the thing with youth apprenticeship, and I will say this at this point, youth apprenticeship is really hard. You're asking a young person who is still in high school to get 2,000 hours of on-the-job training in probably a 2-year period. Plus there's minor worker restrictions that are layered on top of that. So yeah, we'll do a whole segment about prep, and hopefully that I'll be able to answer all your questions. Anyone else before I press on? All right. So what is a registered apprenticeship program in practice? So the way that I kind of think about this and the way that I talk about it is that a registered apprenticeship program really has 4 essential functions. And not every registered apprenticeship program looks the same, but all apprenticeship programs have to recruit. They all both provide and manage the education and training of their apprentices. Administration and coordination is huge. Whether it's a single employer program or a multi-employer program, you have to track the progress of your apprentices, right? Are they getting their work hours in? Are they, I'll use the example of we'll say that you have an apprentice who's been doing road construction for the last 6 months. Well, they have to be able to build high rise. They have to know the high rise setting as well. And there's different job work processes is what we call them, associated with building a skyscraper than there is with building a road, right? So if you know that that apprentice has been building roads for quite a while, you've got to rotate them over to the other types of work that they have to experience before they graduate. Everyone, when they think of administration, thinks about reporting to us. I think for most of our programs, they've got an admin. I mean, Rob, you got what, one admin that does your reporting to us? 4? But that's not all for us, right? Okay. Yeah. We try not to be too more intrusive than we have to be. But there's a lot of administration and coordination of apprentices, and certainly the more that you add, the more coordinating and administrative burden there is on the program. And then finally, you're dealing with humans. This is one of the things that I learned when I was running a program that I had never thought about before. You're dealing with the entire spectrum of the human experience in a way that I didn't think that I would. And you're coordinating that with an employer and their HR people, right? So I mentioned earlier, I'm a veteran. One of the first things that happened is I had a veteran. He moved out to be a part of the program from Chicago. And I found out a month into the program that he was living in his car in Seattle. And I'm like, oh, I have no idea what to do about this, right? And so luckily there were some people within the organization that were plugged into the community-based organizations and other service providers, and we got it sorted out that day, right? But I'd never even considered that I would have to deal with that, or maternity and paternity leave. Okay, well, the program may or may not have a policy around that, but that has to be consistent with what the employer is doing, right? And it has to be consistent with FMLA. So all sorts of things that you wouldn't think about as part of running a registered apprenticeship program that I think every one of our training coordinators can give you stories about the really weird stuff that comes up just dealing with humans. But this is really what a registered apprenticeship program is. And at the end of the day, one of the things that I think is really important to think about is the registered apprenticeship program, it serves the apprentice. But if they're a business, their customer is ultimately the employers, right? So they're there to serve the apprentice, but the employer also has to be happy, because apprenticeship programs get by. They're not you're not selling a car where you're going to sell one every 10 years. You got to make sure that every single apprentice that comes into your program is going to be to the maximum extent possible is going to be somebody that your employers value as well, and their skill sets, right? So that's one of the things about registered apprenticeship programs that I think, if you're interacting with programs, to bear in mind. This is really kind of what they do. All right, so who selects the apprentice? One of the things that I want to say that is a common misunderstanding is that we need to recruit more people for registered apprenticeship. That may be true in some cases. The vast majority of our programs have to cap their number of eligible applicants, and they have high standards for who they will let in. Now, there's a range based on the occupation. So, for example, if we're talking about the laborers and the carpenters, they typically don't have, they may not have an entrance exam. They may or may not require a high school diploma or equivalent coming in. On the other end of the spectrum, we've got like the plumbers and pipe fitters and the UA, where, you're taking a math assessment walking in the door, and, it's very, very competitive, and there's multiple steps, and you have interviews and all of these other types of things, right? So our system is very diverse. When you're applying to a registered apprenticeship program, you're not applying to registered apprenticeship, you're applying to that specific program. It's like when I engage in a lot of public discussion about registered apprenticeship, it's kind of collectivized, right? But the reality is that from program to program, even if they're offering the same occupation, the application process can be completely different. and how competitive it is to get into that specific program can be completely different. So, when we're talking about expanding apprenticeship, generally speaking, what we have to do is add more employers that want to participate in registered apprenticeship and get the existing employers to open up more apprenticeship opportunities if and when they're able, right? And then we can go and recruit more apprentices. So who selects the apprentice? So there's kind of two different models with a multi-employer program. They're dispatch and employer select. The majority of our union programs are dispatch programs, which means that you apply to the program and they will take the best candidates and they will send them to an employer when an opportunity becomes available, right? And that's the point at which they are registered into the program. An employer select program is a program where there is a registered apprenticeship program, but you're going to go around to, maybe the best example of this is actually in the advanced manufacturing setting. You're going to go around to different machine shops. They'll tell you who the machine shops are, but you don't apply to the program through the actual registered apprenticeship program. You have to apply through that machine shop. And the machine shop is selecting their apprentice and sending that apprentice then to the program, right? So those are the two most common, those are really the only two models for a multi-employer program. In a single employer program, typically that means that the employer is selecting the apprentice. That's a little bit more intuitive. Classroom education, or the RSI, as we were talking about earlier, that can be delivered through a whole host of different models. It used to be predominantly in person. We are seeing more live remote instruction these days, for especially, you know, if you're getting theory as opposed to lab type instruction. And that is frequently scheduled to be like at or toward the end of the workday. So the apprentice will work either a full day or a partial day and then go to class. And sometimes they're on the weekends. It just depends on the program. Some programs front load the education a little bit more than others. And then there's a couple different models for assessing apprentices. One, the most common one is time-based. It doesn't mean that they aren't also assessing the apprentice's competency in the occupation. It just means that the most important factor in the apprentice's progress and wages is time. There's the hybrid model where you are taking into account both their OJT, I'm sorry, I should clarify. When I talk about time, I'm only talking about time worked. That's another thing about our system. We prioritize the work experience above the academics in most cases. So the hybrid model, sorry, lost my train of thought there, is a combination of time and competency. And so before an apprentice advances to the next stage of their apprenticeship, not only do they have to have the time in, but then they also have to take a competency assessment, and that can take a number of different forms. And then finally, there's the competency model. In Washington, we still require competency programs to report hours. And so we don't currently have any pure competency programs. All of our programs are either time or hybrid. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah.
Can you clarify if the apprentices have to be paid for the RSI?
Apprentices do not have to be paid for RSI. In fact, the vast majority of apprentices are not paid for RSI. And one of the things that L&I does is we actually cover industrial insurance premiums for unpaid RSI. So I believe that's how registered apprenticeship ended up being tied in at L&I, along with the fact that we do licensure for a lot of the occupations that most heavily use registered apprenticeship. Yeah. Here,
Thank you. I think as a school counselor, the part that I get held up on is the dispatch versus employer select versus single employer versus multi-employer. And how do I support my student in directing them as far as like, hey, you're interested in being an electrician. Hey, look into more of this route or that route. Is there any resource out there that you're aware of that has close to a list in which we can utilize to support our students?
That's a great question. So there's not an easy answer to this one. And this goes back to the 220 different program dynamic, right? So you can go to our website, you can look at all of our programs, you can search by county, you can search by occupation. What you will end up having to do is read their program standards as of right now. And those are listed on the website. You could always have the student go read. If they're not willing to read, they're probably not going to make it through the interview. So at the end of the day, I don't have an easy solution for you. And I'll pick on Rob for a minute just because he's here to be picked on. So if you were to apply to Rob's program and you were to apply to, we'll say, an open shop electrical program, they're going to have two completely different processes for applying, for how they assess, what the criteria is. And at the end of the day, I think one of the really important things is, like, I will just say personally, every job I've ever really wanted, I do a ton of research and prep before I actually turn in my application, and then I do some more before I interview. That's how registered apprenticeship has to be approached if they want to get into a registered apprenticeship program. And so this kind of goes back to my whole thing of, like, in some ways, when we're talking about registered apprenticeship versus college in terms of competitiveness, it's not even close in terms of how competitive it is to get into registered apprenticeship versus college. Now, if we're talking about Yale or Harvard or Stanford, sure, right? But by and large, if we're talking about state schools, it's actually harder to get into a registered apprenticeship program than it is to get into most of those state schools. So your students need to be absolutely, direct them, tell them that there are multiple ways to get in, and then they're going to have to go. That's why it's in the apprenticeship standards, what the minimum qualifications are, what the selection procedures are. And I would really encourage all of you that work with young people, if you do have young people that are interested, talk to your local programs. One of the things that I really like about working in apprenticeship is, like, it has a pretty awesome sense of community. Most of our programs will be very willing to, especially with a counselor, to say, okay, this is what we look for. Some of them might be able to tell you what the median score was coming in, so you have some kind of idea to tell kids, like, this is what you're going to need to be looking at. They all publish their minimum, right? But then there's also what you need to be able to do to be competitive. So there's not a silver bullet in that sense, and we have gotten a lot of requests to, like, have it on the website. Once again, though, it changes regularly, and it gets really tricky for us in terms of, like, we're a regulatory entity, but we also promote registered apprenticeship, and how do we find that balance? So hopefully that's not too long of a meandering non-answer.
Jordan, I will ask a question. To her point, in your experience, what are there some general things that most apprenticeships are looking for that you could advise counselors and other folks working with young people to really be paying attention to, and to be developing as they are looking at these opportunities?
Yeah, so I think first and foremost, maturity. I'm going to use myself as an example. So I went to school down in Chehalis. I grew up with my dad working at the coal mine, and my grandfather and my uncle worked out at the power plant. I got into UW, and before I started at UW, I worked out at the steam plant as a helper. And because of my background, instead of, sweeping floors and stuff, I was getting to help rebuild mills and welding and doing all that kind of stuff, right? But I was an idiot at 18. And I thought I was invincible, and I didn't have great situational awareness. And one day we were bringing an I-beam down through a bay, and I took my eyes off it to move something from underneath, and I caught something out of the corner of my eye. Well, you guys know these huge bays, they'll get a bunch of wind going through them. That I-beam, one of my coworkers one of the other helpers had let go of it, and it started swinging around, and I ducked just in time as it slammed into the wall. Like, it would have taken my head off. We're talking about like a 30-foot long, 3-foot high I-beam, right? And so I'm giving you that story to say, like, that wasn't the only time that something happened that where I could have been potentially injured, that I wasn't thinking about it because I was 18 years old, right? It took me until I was in my early 20s to have some sense of seriousness about life and the world and all of those types of things. And I grew up around that stuff, right? I fixed my own car. My dad made me, put in all the French drains all around the house they built. I hate shoveling drain rock still. And so anyway, when you're talking about people that are a good fit for apprenticeship out of high school, I mean, it's not just a kid who has mechanical aptitude or, a young person who is good at engaging with grownups. It's all of the above. It's the employability skills. It's the ability to recognize when there is something that they need to be very conscious of in a workplace. They have to be smart enough to compete with all the 23, 24, 25, 26-year-olds, right? Like, there's a reason that the median age coming into registered apprenticeship is 26 right now. It's actually come down over time. It was got up to around 28 there for a while, or when I first started. But right now it's right around 26, and there's a reason for that. They've had time to develop those things, right? They've gained some work experience. There are some very successful young people who are very good apprentices. And I do not want to suggest that there aren't, because there absolutely are. But, kind of going back to this idea of like apprenticeship is not monolithic. You might have somebody that could be a great apprentice right now in one occupation, but not another. And that's really where the judgment kind of comes in. But what I will tell you is that you're looking for the exceptional young person that is motivated enough to know what they want to do and mature enough to be safe on a job site and has the employability skills that they're not going to show up 15 minutes late, because that will get you kicked off of most job sites faster than anything else. You start showing up late and people have no tolerance for it, right? You have your phone out when you're supposed to be working on something. You don't take your ring off when you're operating a piece of machinery. Those are the types of things that will get somebody in trouble in the workplace and correspondingly in their apprenticeship in a hurry. So.
Go ahead and show them how to use the arts database for the counselors in the room. You mentioned the L&I website, and then maybe even if you could pull up one of those program standards and show them where those minimum quals are.
Sure. And while I'm navigating the internet,
I was just going to say, Jordan, I wonder if we do that after the break, because there's some tech going on up there.
Okay.
But that would be a great maybe lead into the after the break.
All right, so we're going to rain check navigating our website, but we'll come back to it. So what about youth apprenticeship? I mentioned this earlier. This is really tough, right? So a lot of what you hear referred to as youth apprenticeship is more like youth paid internship in other states. We do have programs which contemplate youth in Washington. We do not have, I believe we have 1 or 2 programs that are youth only, and they're relatively small. So there's a couple things about youth apprenticeship that is hard. Fitting in 2,000 hours of paid work experience while somebody in high school is the first challenge, right? And my mom is a retired teacher. I spent a lot of time growing up around educators. Of course, now I'm working with WEA, which is kind of hilarious and ironic at the same time. So one of the things that I will just say right off the bat is, like, how many parents want their kid to spend all of their time out of school only working instead of doing band or, sports or other extracurricular activities? There's a transportation issue, right? If they don't have their own car or it's not reliable, that becomes an issue. And then you got minor work law. 80% of registered apprenticeship is building construction trades. Where is it hardest to get minors into work? building construction trades, right? So there are a lot of structural barriers there. So I talked about what's going on in other states. There's a lot of awareness of I'm going to refer to it as the Western European model. You know, there were groups that went to Switzerland and other Western European countries here in Washington a few years ago, and everyone came back talking about how we need to do that. So there's some things to understand that are so structurally and culturally different that it frankly, like that comparison is almost impossible in a lot of ways. So number one, I was stationed in Germany while I was in the Air Force, right? They let kids go to the bar and drink up until 7 or 8 p.m. in the evening when they're 15 and 16 years old without being accompanied. That's not something that we do here in the States. The amount of independence and trust that young people are given in other parts of the country, or other parts of the world, excuse me, earlier in their lives is very different than how we treat young adults in the United States, right? And so there's a level of maturity and independence that they've already experienced by the time that they're hitting 16, 17, 18 years old. Secondly, their employment is subsidized directly by the government while they are young people. So it doesn't cost the employer as much, kind of getting to your subsidy question. But the difference here is that they have them for a longer period of time, and then they plan to retain them. So it's more entrenched, right? It's not a turnover type of situation. I'm going to have this young person start in my organization starting with when they're 14 with the hopes that when they graduate at 18, they're going to be fully qualified walking in the door. I know them, they know me, all of those things have taken place. The third thing, and I actually think this might be the biggest barrier. They track their kids earlier. They will tell young people, nah, you're not going to gymnasium. You didn't get good enough test scores, right? Now, they do have bridge programs, is what we refer to them here in the United States, where if you don't go to gymnasium and you go the apprenticeship route in Europe, you can go to college later. But they are very practical about how they approach their kids. And I've got a couple kids, and so I interact with other parents. And, I would never say to them, yeah, Jimmy's not going to be an astronaut. He's an idiot, right? That's not something that we do as a society. Other societies are way more pragmatic about that, right? And I want to be clear here. I was talking about how apprenticeship isn't a lesser pathway. It's not. One of the other things in those European countries is that they have such a range of of apprenticeship opportunities and occupational training opportunities that when they track kids, apprenticeship is like it's not for the kids that can't test in a gymnasium. It's like a choice type of situation, right? So there's all sorts of structural and cultural barriers that exist to youth apprenticeship. And I think that's something that's important to be really clear-eyed about, especially if you're working with young people, is like, think about you if you're making hiring decisions. We'll say you're a high school counselor and you're going to hire your peer. How many of you are going to hire an 18-year-old? There might be some 18-year-olds you would hire. Are you just going to say, give me any old 18-year-old though? Probably not, right? So it's when you're talking about apprenticeship as a system, it is not monolithic, and understanding the variables and what's unique in each of these programs and acknowledging the difference in students is really important. Is there a better way to connect students to registered apprenticeship opportunities? That is going to be apprenticeship prep, and I think that's where we're going next. So that means that I'll take any questions that people have, and then we can take a little breather, or at least I'm going to take a breather. Yeah. Here.
Thank you. I just had a question from the K-12 perspective again. do you think the legislature knows that I'm looking at pathways and graduation pathways and kind of the options that we're hoping to open up for students? And my, I guess, hope was that apprenticeship would be more open and accessible. And the way it's presented, it makes it sound like that's, maybe more of a possibility than it is. And I'm just wondering if the legislature knows what you're telling us about apprenticeships.
Well, what I would say is that much like any area of political discourse, there is the practical reality and then there's the idealistic take, right? So we do a lot of work with OSPI, right? I specifically do a fair amount of work with OSPI, and we do want to build better pathways. However, unless the legislature is going to start telling every company in the state or some subset of companies in the state who they are going to hire and how they are going to hire, there is very limited influence that they have on this system because it's industry driven, right? Like this is an area in which a lot of the public discourse, I think, it comes from a great place. But ultimately, the best way to grow apprenticeship is to incentivize companies. Now, I'll give you an example of an area in which I think the legislature just did a great job. Is the Governor's Aerospace Workforce Council was formed. So some of you may know that Boeing used to get a pretty hefty B&O tax break in Washington. And Airbus hated that. And so they sued the United States and Washington through the WTO. And that B&O tax break went away. And so what is currently in place in legislation is an apprenticeship utilization rate target that if Boeing and other aerospace and advanced manufacturing companies in Washington hit that apprenticeship utilization rate, then they are eligible for a reduced B&O tax rate. So things like that are a great way for the legislature to influence private industry's adoption of registered apprenticeship. And that is a way to do it. And those conversations are starting to happen more.
And let me just add to Jordan. I think where Jordan is going after the break also may be a way to better access for young people apprenticeship. He's going to be talking about apprenticeship preparation and pre-apprenticeship and what that looks like. And so that may be sort of what you're looking for in terms of how to direct young people toward these types of opportunities.
100%. Thank you. I am excited to get into what I'd refer to as more of the happy good news portion of the presentation, aside from the here's all the barriers that we face portion of this. So I'm going to start off by kind of just going through what does exist online. So if you go to the L&I website, you go to the apprenticeship site here, and the first thing that I'm going to say is I think before I get too far, Rob, how many apprentices do you have right now? Okay, perfect.
Rob said 620. Is that right?
Yes. So I'm going to pick on Rob's program some more because he's right here in the local area, and he's got a good sized program, right? So you can literally just Google L&I apprenticeship and you'll land on our, it'll be like the first hit. What you want to do here is go down to this arts tab. It's right here, and there's other content on the website as well. You can search for apprenticeship programs, and as you can see here, we're in Island County, Skagit. Oh man, I'm like the rock star that doesn't know where he is anymore. And we'll say I'm gonna just type in inside. One of the things that is helpful is if you know the apprenticeship name of an occupation. So an inside wireman is an 01 electrician. You can also type in electrician. A lot of times it'll come up, but learning the lingo will help. So right here, we've got Rob's program. And if I want to be an inside wireman, first of all, I can see what the journey level wage rate is. How many of you have ever seen a college publish graduating expected earnings for every single one of their programs? Man, that would, I'll just say this, didn't exist for me when I, it's been a minute though. So anyway, that's one of the first things you know, if you're looking and you have a student that's interested, or you're trying to direct somebody through into this system, you'll see not only what the journey level wage rate is, you'll see the percentage of what they make walking in the door and the progression and how many hours they need to complete. So one of the things that I will say that is very important to L&I, WSATC, to our stakeholders in general, is we try to be as transparent as we possibly can be to applicants. This is what you're signing up for. This is what you're going to make. And one of the other things to know is this $55 here, that's actually the lowest rate among all of the counties reported to us. So all of this is expressed in minimums. So when you're looking at this data, no matter what the program is, what we put out there is the minimum for that program. And that's part of that is driven by the fact that, you know, this is all for us about making sure that the worker, that labor understands what their expectations are in terms of being an apprentice. So I was talking about looking at the program standards. If you have somebody who's interested in a program, these can be very long documents. And I will tell you right now that for a lot of people, they would be very dense, but there are two sections that are typically less dense and are very important for getting into a registered apprenticeship program. And those are sections 2 and 3. So we have all this great stuff about Rob's program. Section 1, you may want to look at as well. That's the counties that the program operates in. One of the realities for a lot of registered apprenticeship opportunities is that you're going to be commuting to different job sites, right? Absolutely, there are apprenticeship programs that operate in a plant environment. There are apprenticeship program or contractors where you go to the shop and then you take the company rig out to the job site. But there's also you know, situations where people are going from home to the job site, right? So that's something to prepare individuals for. And so this tells you all of the different areas that that the program has contractors in and where they do work. But this is where the rubber really starts hitting the road. Minimum qualifications. So this is the absolute minimum that somebody has to be, these are their qualifications on paper at an absolute minimum to get into the program. One of the things that you're going to notice right off the bat, minimum age is 18 years old, full stop, right? I'm not going to read all of this. Some of these are a little bit shorter. Some of them are a little bit longer. Next category is education. All right, so if I want to be, if I want to apply to this program, I have to be a high school graduate or have a, you know, equivalency or GED. I've got to show evidence of successful completion of 1 full year of high school algebra with a passing grade of a C or better. And this all relates to the math question here, it looks like. And you got to complete the math certification online. So right here, even to apply, you have to provide evidence that you've gone and done something on your own, right? Like, that's how you know a program is competitive. When, if you're reading their min quals and you've got to do something to meet those min quals like this, like that means, Rob, you got 620 apprentices. How many applicants would you say you get in a year? So if Rob has 620 apprentices and most of your programs are 4 years, right? That means on average, he's registering 155 apprentices a year. So he's got a 10-to-1 ratio of applicants to apprentices. That's how competitive it is to get into his program. All right, so without reading all of the min quals here, right? This spells out everything that somebody needs to do to meet the minimum qualifications. Then we get to section 3, selection procedures. I'm not going to read these to you verbatim, but this is going to lay out how the program selects apprentices. Every single program in Washington State has both of these sections. And if the language there is ambiguous, please let the program know. We will work with them to make it less ambiguous or easier to understand to the extent that we're able. In some cases, they just have a fairly complicated or like a very long process for selecting apprentices, right? And Rob, just out of curiosity, that number of applicants, that's people that meet the min quals, right? Yeah, so we'll say that Rob's got a 10-to-1 ratio of applicants to apprentices who actually get in. That's only people that applied that met the min quals, because they have to screen for min quals before they even move into the next stage. So not every program is as competitive as our IBEW electrical programs. I'm going to be the first to tell you that if I had to venture a guess, our IBEW and UA programs are probably the most competitive programs to get into in the state. And a 10-to-1 applicant to registration ratio is not uncommon at all for those programs. However, there are other programs that aren't as competitive for some of the trades that are that don't require licensure in particular. So when you start overlapping into licensed occupations, that typically is where things get really, really competitive. Does anyone have any questions about what I put up here, about our website, or taking a look at what's in the standards? All right, finally, there's another source of information. You don't just have to go to our website. You can go to the program's website. Now, because we don't regulate these and they belong to the programs, what I will tell you is there is a wide array of how helpful the website is. My personal advice for those of you that work with young people and that are counselors, I would figure out what programs are in your area from each of some of the major disciplines, right? So maybe electrical, plumbing and pipe fitting, ironworking, carpentry, laborers. Try and get their coordinator to either come talk to you, or maybe a group like the Educational Service District could convene something where they can come and talk to everyone all at once, right? Because they are busy people, and sometimes that, you know, if they're dealing with every counselor in a county on a one-off basis, that could be taxing. But our coordinators, by and large, are very approachable, and they're in the position because they wanted to work with apprentices. Typically, they're going to tell you what you would want to know in order to help somebody apply to their program, because their whole role is getting people into the program and successfully completing them. One of the things that a lot of people don't understand about registered apprenticeship programs is that they lose money for every single person that doesn't complete their program, because they've invested the time and money to educate and train and manage them through it, and then they lose them along the way, right? That is a problem. So there we go. Very much encourage everyone to engage with our stakeholders, or with our programs. I'll hit this one. I must.
And Jordan, one
Yeah.
thing to add to that.
So many of you guys are familiar with the Wave Tour that we run in the fall. And so with the Wave Tour, we've developed a bunch of different contacts in a bunch of these different, particularly the union apprenticeships, but we have started getting some connections with some of the open shop apprenticeship options as well. And so we've had a couple of counselors that have already reached out saying, hey, do you have a contact for, it was actually electricians that they were trying to get connected with. I was able to reach out to them, find out who the best person is to connect the student with. And we were able to get the student, counselor, and the electricians all connected. So if you guys have students that come to you saying, I really want to go into this, and it's some kind of an apprenticeship-based field, and if you're not sure, you don't already have a contact for that group, feel free to reach out to us. We are happy to try and help do some of that legwork to help get you all connected. And then also, if you guys are in any of the 4 northern counties and some of the schools in Snohomish, we would love to have you guys come to the Wave Tour. In the fall, we usually get between 5 and 6 different union apprenticeship groups that come together, and the students get to go station by station and do it. Usually it's conduit bending with the apprentices in the electrician station, and the operating engineers come in. Lots of different groups are there. So we would love to have you guys join us. So watch for emails with information about that event coming out probably the end of this school year, because the event will take place probably in October again. And us is the Career Connect Northwest network here at the ESD.
And I also send a staff member to that each year who enjoys talking to apprentices and used to run the laborers program. He's a great guy. So, yeah, all sorts of different ways to get connected. I'm going to be the first to say that, like, one of the things that I think is underrated between different organizations working, obviously I work for the government. Building relationships isn't just for businesses, right? And that I can't tell you how important it is to have a relationship with folks if you want to have a better understanding of how to help apprentices get into programs. Because then you get to a level where you can ask them a question of like, all right, I've got this young person, they're number 500 on your ranked list. Most of our dispatch programs use a ranked list, and then they dispatch in order of rank, right? What are their odds of getting in if they're at 500? How do they raise their rank? Those are types of things that are very real for somebody applying to a registered apprenticeship program that a lot of people don't know about. So this is an area where, there's a lot of time and attention put on how to get into college, but registered apprenticeship is more competitive, and there's actually more ins and outs, right? It's not just about grades and extracurriculars and how good your personal statement is. So when we're talking about youth, we, from a policy standpoint, have really started trying to encourage a robust preparatory system. And we refer to this as a recognized apprenticeship preparation program. You will hear me call it pre-apprenticeship probably a number of times. We stopped calling it pre-apprenticeship for a very specific reason, because there was an issue with confusion about everything that takes place prior to apprenticeship is technically pre-apprenticeship, right? And we want this to be a focused system whose goal is to prepare people to be successful applicants into and successful apprentices. One of the things about apprenticeship is that a lot of people, they don't realize that maybe they don't like working out in the rain, and we live in Washington, right? Or maybe power tools make them nervous. Maybe they don't like heights. All of these things are relevant if you're looking at getting into particularly a building and construction trade apprenticeship. And if you don't know that in advance, or you don't have the opportunity to overcome that, that's a tough thing to do on a job site, right? So first and foremost, recognize apprenticeship preparation programs, which I'm going to refer to for the sake of my mouth as pre-apprenticeship moving forward, they're recognized by the Washington State Apprenticeship and Training Council. L&I has a significant role in the preparatory space, much more so than in the registered apprenticeship space. we actually have the ability to grant continuing recognition without it going to the council and some other things like that. So recognized prep programs must provide education and training specifically designed to help individuals become competitive applicants into registered apprenticeship programs and successful future apprentices. So this means that I'm going to pick on shop classes just here for a minute, and I want to be the first to say that we need more shop classes and more CTE instruction. But just taking generalized shop instruction and calling it a preparatory program won't pass muster, right? We are looking for specific occupational training, not just here's a drill press, make me a recipe box, right? We are looking for that to be a more robust carpentry program. Maybe you frame and build a tiny house. That's something that a number of our preparatory programs do, right? It gives a broader, if we're talking about carpentry, that's a much broader and more practical skill set to the building construction trades than building a recipe box. And I'm using that example because I remember doing that in shop class. So the other thing here is that we have 3 areas of focus for preparatory programs. One is employability skills. I was talking about 18-year-olds. I genuinely believe that there are a meaningful number of young people that if we give them more time and focus on developing their employability skills, they will get it sooner, right? Don't use your weird internet speak from Reddit in your emails, dummy, right? Those are the types of things that have to be taught. Don't get your phone out. I'll give you an example. So when I was in the Air Force, obviously most of the guys coming in are 18 and 19 years old, and I'm supervising them. And I knew, I didn't, when I came in, smartphones were just a thing and the data plans were really expensive, right? But by the time I was supervising guys, that was not the case. Everyone's like showing up to work. They've got smartphones and they're way more engaged with their phones than I had been when I came in. One of the first things that I had to do is like put your phone in your locker and it doesn't come out until we're done for the day, right? I had to break them of that habit. Those are the types of things that are employability skills that, that's really important to employers. I'm paying for your work, not your texting. So those types of skill sets, how to properly interact with coworkers, nobody wants to hire drama. They want to hire productivity. So that's a piece of this for sure, but it can't just be employability skills. It's also got to be occupationally specific skills and knowledge. And then finally, and very importantly, safety. Safety can be OSHA. It can be the things like, you got to tie off once you're over, 6 feet these days? I remember my dad came along when I was working on the roof and he said, if L&I catches you doing that, you're going to be in trouble. I was like, well, so anyway, those are the types of things that have to be part of any recognized preparatory program. And to that end, there's really 2 purposes. What we're trying to accomplish here is 1, enhancing access. And this is, young people fit into underrepresented populations in the registered apprenticeship world, right? So we want to expand and improve access to registered apprenticeship opportunities. And then we also want to provide our registered apprenticeship programs with greater access to a diverse talent pool, whether that's race, age, gender. One of the things about registered apprenticeship that is changing with time, and it has changed a lot just in the last few years, is it used to be the type of thing where I knew registered apprenticeship was a pathway because that's what I grew up around. Did other people, when 20 years ago, when they were thinking about what to do coming out of high school? I would say that the answer was largely no. And that is something that we are actively, L&I is working on changing, is helping people understand not only that the opportunity is there, but what the opportunity presents. but also being, realistic and balanced about that. And then I had mentioned this earlier, but we are trying to distinguish recognized preparatory programs from more generalized career preparation programs, right? So Career Connect Washington has career prep and career launch. And depending on how you think about it, our preparatory system is probably closer to career launch than it is to career prep, in the sense that all of our preparatory programs, to get approved, have to have at least one articulation agreement with a registered apprenticeship program. And that is a pretty big deal. So there's, once again, going back to the national landscape and some of the more generalized dialogue, a lot of times apprenticeship preparation programs, pre-apprenticeship programs are kind of like I've got a building and construction trade skills program, and I'm going to call it a pre-apprenticeship program. That is not what these are. So I'm going to give you an example. I'm going to keep picking on Rob because he's here. Thank you, Rob, for being so patient. We'll say Rob wants to have a preparatory program, right? And he finds a school district where they've got a grant or something, and they want to build an electrical lab. And they've got an instructor that can actually teach this stuff, which is also a challenge that a lot of schools have, I know. And it's not just at the K through 12 level, like it's also a problem for the college system, both 2 and 4 year, finding qualified instructors for whether it's nursing or it's electrical work. That can be tough because the industry pays well. So in order for this to become a recognized program, Rob has to be willing to provide the completers of that program with a defined benefit. And that means that they either have to have additional points on their application or credit for prior learning when they come into the program. That means that they may or may not bump up a step. They may or may not be excused from school. But basically, what we're saying at L&I is industry, aka registered apprenticeship programs, have to recognize the value of this education and training to such an extent that they are going to provide an advantage, like a defined advantage to people coming out of that preparatory program. So if it's a multiple occupational preparatory program, you have to have multiple articulation agreements. And we have a number of programs that do that very successfully. We set a minimum articulation goal of 15% into registered apprenticeship, and we can track that because you have to report all of the people that come into your preparatory program to us, and then we will evaluate that. Initially, we're going to evaluate it over the first year and a half, and then after that, we'll take a look every 3 years. We are framing this as a 15% goal because it is harder to get young people into registered apprenticeship. And we do want to make sure that there are opportunities for preparatory programs that serve communities with barriers to employment. So one of our most well-known and successful programs actually takes place it's for incarcerated individuals. And it's so that when they get out, they have built a skill set that will allow them to be employable in private industry. We have also put in place a requirement that individuals have to be currently enrolled in the program prior to us evaluating it for approval. We had an issue with grant funding creating some really weird incentives about, I'm going to take this thing and make it a pre-apprenticeship program, and L&I, you have to approve it now. And so now we're basically saying, nope, you have to have people currently enrolled. And if you get a grant after we recognize you, that's awesome. But there is a number of different funding streams now that are tied to whether or not the program is recognized. The program has to be at least 80 hours in duration. Most of them are longer than that, but at least 80 hours. There are some occupations where we can see a pathway where 80 hours is realistic. At least half of it has to be focused on occupationally specific skills. And then, like I said, the employability skills, safety skills, and knowledge. Yes.
I'm just curious to know, do we have any apprenticeship preparation programs here today?
So we are in CTA, Northwest Career and Technical Academy, and you're picking on Rob, and Rob actually is in our articulation agreement, and we just got finalized about 3 weeks ago. So we're really excited about it.
Congratulations, everyone. And that I say that in all seriousness. I know I tend to joke around a little bit, but really getting articulation agreements in place it's a big lift for everyone involved, right? Like the program needs to take a long, hard look at what the preparatory program is delivering and all of those types of things before they sign on the dotted line. And a lot of times for the preparatory program, it's a little bit of a sales pitch and it might require some adjustment and some other things. So that's awesome. And congratulations. That's great. Like I said, we're now requiring preparatory programs to report via the ARTS system, and that's how we track articulation. Once that person comes into the system as a preparatory completer, we can directly track them. So for your preparatory participants, if and when Rob registers them, it will actually take all of their information from when they're a prep participant and pull it over and populate it for Rob's admins, because I know Rob's not keying that in by himself. So that's great. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the application process. And the first thing that I will say is we are happy to meet with you just to answer questions, right? You don't have to come to us with this is what I'm doing, this is my application package, all that kind of stuff. Like, we are very happy to have an exploratory conversation. So Rio Frame is currently the person who is running point on apprenticeship preparation. She's awesome and very smart. And I'll just talk about her briefly. So one of the very interesting things that happened is we got a grant 3 or 4 years ago, which allowed me to hire a pre-apprenticeship navigator. And I got this application from a practicing lawyer who had gone to Gonzaga. And I was like, this is very interesting. Why is this person applying for this position? Turned out it was Rio. So she spent a couple of years working with one of our preparatory programs doing, she just wanted a career change, right? So she spent a couple of years with one of our preparatory programs doing interview coaching and helping them interact with our registered apprenticeship programs, building more articulation agreements, all that kind of stuff. And she was so successful that now she's in charge of the whole thing. And she can talk about it from all those various angles. So if you have questions, she is an awesome, awesome resource. Did you have a question in the back? No. Oh, you're just stretching. Okay. So one of the biggest things that, like I said, ask questions. She can talk to you more about the criteria. Once again, prep is not monolithic. It's not one size fits all. There are a lot of different ways to successfully operate a preparatory program. And then one of the things that she will do is she'll tell you whether or not you're likely to get approved in that application process, right? So like I said, we make a recommendation to the WSATC. It's ultimately their decision, but I'm going to say it's been 4 or 5 years that the department's recommendation hasn't aligned up with what the department, or with what the WSATC ultimately did. Let's see here. Talk through all of this. So we do have a 45-day cutoff. So we have to publish everything prior to WSATC meetings because they're public meetings. And one of the other things you can find is WSATC meetings on our website. We do come up to Bellingham, and Rachel, I'm going to put you on the spot. Do you know if there's a Bellingham meeting this year? I think we do it like every other year, and I can't remember if it's on or off year.
Your boss told me yesterday it is in Bellingham, but you guys don't have the hotel location.
Okay, so we're coming up here soon. I I would encourage all of you to join or to attend, just so you can kind of see how this works administratively. And then there are a couple of the Wednesday before the WSATC meeting. Really probably the meeting that I would say if I were working with young people that would be the most interesting to me is we have a Washington State Coordinators Association meeting. And that's all of Rob's counterparts from all of our different programs. We'll talk about what they're doing, what's going on in apprenticeship. I learn from it every single quarter. So that is one thing to be aware of as an opportunity if you want to continue engaging in this space, and I haven't scared you off yet. That's not my intention, but I didn't get any laughs. So, so apprenticeship program types and sponsorship. I'm gonna skip through this. In fact, I think I'm actually at the end of my content for this particular group. This is the quote unquote like standards builder. Do I have any employers in here that are seriously considering starting their own registered apprenticeship program? Going once, going twice. All right. I'm gonna skip this as well. I'm going to skip this as well. All right. So I might have actually ended it ahead of time. Does anyone else have any more questions before I go sit in the back without a microphone?
Edmonds College, this is really loud. Edmonds College has a program that's a pre-apprenticeship program, construction trades. And I've been referring students to that. I'd like to know approximately, if a kid goes through that 10-week program, what's their chances of getting a registered apprenticeship?
So I do not have numbers for individual prep programs at this point in time. So your question actually brings up something really interesting, which is I'm wondering if we should start publishing articulation rates once we have a larger data set. So this change to the apprenticeship preparation system, I started working on rewriting the policy 2 years ago. Yeah, so it went into effect in July, I want to say July of 2023. It's new. Maybe it was January 2023. I think January 2023. So couple things that we're doing, and this is hopefully this is helpful for information for all of the people here that are maybe referring young people to preparatory programs. We didn't want to like shock all of our existing preparatory programs by essentially kicking them out or saying overnight you have to do this thing. And we've always had a rolling 3-year recognition cycle. So our entire policy changed. And so when they come up for what we refer to as continued recognition, when they get reevaluated on that 3-year cycle, then they have to make their program conform with the new requirements. And basically everything I talked about is a new requirement. The previous preparatory environment was like, we were like, yeah, come forward and we'll give you a stamp, right? And then money started getting attached to it. And we actually had some people that were rather frustrated that the system wasn't like directly linked to the registered apprenticeship community in a more meaningful fashion. So what I would say right now is for any program, we don't have enough data to really give you a strong answer, because even for the ones that I have a year worth of data on, I mean, it's 1 year of data, right? And that's, we kind of got to give them a little bit more time to build a track record. I'll give you an example. There's a technical college that has, they've got like a diesel tech program, and they've got, I want to say an HVAC program. They were at 0% in their first year. And it's not because they have a poor program. Like, we know that their graduates get employed, but they just hadn't been focusing on getting those people into registered apprenticeship instead of just employment in general. I would say like maybe 3 years from now, I'm gonna mull maybe putting that on the website, because I do think that would be both a great incentive for our programs to keep working hard to engage with our registered apprenticeship community, but also, like I said, truth in advertising is something that we really strive for, because we kind of sit in the middle here at L&I. Hopefully that answered your question. Sorry.
Have a fee, or there's some sort of tuition?
Yeah.
Is there a class of apprenticeship programs that falls into, or can you name specific employment where you have to pay to get into these apprenticeship programs, and how does that cut into the wage scale?
So that's a complicated question, because like, for example, some programs have a, like, if you don't stay with the union for X amount of time after you graduate, then you owe us for what we paid for your education type of clause, right? So I'm not really sure how you quantify that. And that changes from program to program. We do have programs where they do the instruction through a community college. And particularly for smaller programs, it might be more common that the apprentice pays for that. One of the settings that I came across a PUD where one of their apprentices was paying for some classes, but not all their classes were at the community college. And also for the apprentice, they have to get a 50% tuition waiver from the college by virtue of being an apprentice. So once again, this is not to like be dodging your question. There's so much variance, right? Like, one of the things that, like, if you don't take anything else away from everything that we've talked about today, is that every single program is different. People think about apprenticeship as being very regulatory. And I will just tell you that, like, it isn't that regulatory. There are some boxes that have to be checked. But once those boxes are checked, we're golden on all sorts of different things, right? So you could be charging apprentices tuition. You could not be charging apprentices tuition. You could be a competency-based program. You can be a time-based program. You can be so many different things. So there's not a clean, good answer to your question. What I will say is that for the programs that do charge tuition, from what I have seen, which isn't everything, it is quite low. Like, I mean, we're talking like a quarter of what somebody would pay at a community college, or a half of what somebody would typically pay at a community college per year, because they're not doing full-time enrollment. And it's a smaller portion of the actual apprenticeship experience. So the WSATC does make a practice of, if the apprentice is going to be paying tuition, asking how much it is and what the burden is going to be. And so as a result, from what I have seen, they are relatively low. But I don't have a solid answer. I'm sorry. Yeah.
So we really appreciate the partnership with Robin, our other partner, in developing the pre-apprenticeship program. But what is the incentive for other organizations who offer this training apprenticeship style to engage with us now on their side to help improve that 15% employment rate? So on the industry side, labor and industries, what kind of supports are given so we can make those further connections?
So I talked about how Rio came into L&I. I'm in the process of hiring 2 more of that position, and I refer to it as a pre-apprenticeship navigator. I'll have one for Eastern Washington, one for Western Washington. And their entire goal is to help our preparatory programs increase their articulation rates into registered apprenticeship. So some of that is going to be making introductions. Some of that might be directly interfacing with preparatory students and, doing a class on how to interview for a registered apprenticeship program, right? Some of that might be going to programs and saying, hey, did you know you have a preparatory program right over here? that you're not working with? Are you interested? Would you like me to make an introduction, right? So those are some things that we can do. Ultimately, what I will tell you though, is that we are very focused on, we are never going to put ourselves in a situation where we are telling a registered apprenticeship program to work with a preparatory program. The preparatory program will have to make the argument that they generate enough value and provide enough skill to their graduates that the registered apprenticeship program wants to engage. L&I is never going to put itself in a position to be telling industry what they need to be doing with talent evaluation, right? And that's what that would be tantamount to. So we are happy to make introductions. We're happy to help preparatory participants and completers, try and help them become more competitive when it comes to applying to programs, and try and build the connections within the apprenticeship and preparatory communities. But we do have limitations on how far we can go with that. Is that hopefully? It's a symbiotic relationship, but there's a pecking order, right? Because at the end of the day, this is an employment decision at the registered apprenticeship level, right? So we aren't ever going to be putting our programs in a situation where they are altering employment decisions, right? So it's about making sure that the preparatory programs are strong enough and good enough to be generating the value that they are willing to incorporate that in the employment decision.
Hi, I'm the career counselor at Blaine High School. And so I'm just trying to think if I have a student who is wanting construction, we're up near the border. So I think the closest pre-prep was down in Marysville, so over an hour away for us. I know there's apprenticeships more local, but how do I encourage my students to seek apprenticeship when going straight into the workforce, working for one of our local construction firms or going to Bellingham Tech almost looks like a better option than joining an apprenticeship?
Yeah, that's hard, right? So if I were talking to my kid, so my kids are pretty young right now, they're 7 and 10, but in a future state where I'm talking to them about this, what I would tell them is that, yeah, you might make a similar amount of money walking in the door at the apprenticeship and what you're going to make walking in the door at employment opportunity X, Y, or Z, right? But the difference in what you're going to be making in 4 years is massive. Because in 4 years at company X, Y, and Z, you might be a rock star and you have to wait for somebody to retire to move up, right? Or they may not have a whole lot of direct upward mobility. You go to a registered apprenticeship program and suddenly, like, Rob, how many current training agents do you have right now? So Rob's got 80 different employers that he spreads 620 apprentices across, right? So you're not talking about one employer, one advancement opportunity. You're not talking about wage stagnation. You're actually talking about a system that is entirely designed to create somebody who has career sustaining employment skills or and technical skills, right? And on top of that, you're also hooking into that program's entire group of employers. So I'll give you a hypothetical situation. You got an employer that runs into trouble, goes out of business, or we'll say they don't have a project going on. As an apprentice, what ends up happening is you get dispatched to a different job site. Now, it might not happen immediately, but guess what? You would qualify for an employment by virtue of being a registered apprentice if in that scenario. And then on top of that, the program is going to help you find your next gig. That's their responsibility as a program, right? If that happens with one of the companies in your area, you're not in the same situation at all. And then finally, like the journey level credential and the value that brings It's just, there's no comparison. You can go anywhere in the country and you got a journey level card and you can walk on to most construction sites. Right? So, short term, your student might be right. Long term, it's gonna be the exception, not the rule, that they end up in a similar situation career-wise that somebody that went through an apprenticeship will. Yeah. Fire away.
So I'm Danielle. I'm with Everett Public Schools. I'm a CTE facilitator. And my first question is, do you as an L&I department have any kind of resources for a counselor, or I work with career specialists who are always asking for like short video clips of like, here's what it means to be in this program, or is that something that you have or can work on or provide?
So, sadly, our marketing budget doesn't exist. However, our programs, and Rob,
Yep, so our website has a day in the life of an apprentice. It's a YouTube video. It's just a few minutes, maybe 5 minutes long. It goes through a typical day of an apprentice on their job site, from waking up till getting home, and what it looks like for a typical day. And there's other things like that. Once again, reach out to different programs, but that one is for all the electrician programs, but it's pretty typical for apprenticeship.
Yeah, so
Rob, remind us, what is that website again?
Yep, so ours is nwejatc.org.
So to follow up on what Rob was saying, generally speaking, that's something that the programs will do. We at L&I, the way that we promote apprenticeship is more by doing things like this. Puts us in a difficult situation if we're advertising opportunities and then something doesn't turn out, or there's a compliance issue, right? So we're always kind of trying to find the balance. So generally speaking, our advertisement is like doing more of like a kind of an educational talk of this variety.
And then my next question was, how many the pre-apprenticeship programs are in Washington State right now? And then also, are there any at the high school level?
So there's a bunch at the high school level. That one's easier to answer. Some of you may be familiar with House Bill 1013. So I have a couple of staff members that I hired explicitly to help with the implementation of 1013, and 1013 funds high schools to create more preparatory programs. So the grant funds are being administered by OSPI. However, L&I is responsible for making sure that those grant funds create the outcome of more preparatory programs. I went way down a rabbit hole and I missed part of your question there. Oh, number of programs.
Yeah.
I believe we're currently standing at about 40. For the sake of transparency, I think that once the new prep policy is fully implemented, if we're not accounting for new programs coming in, because that's hard for me to project, I think that number will end up right around 30. So I do think that we're going to see some reduction in the size of our preparatory program because we are putting specific targets in place. However, there is more funding for preparatory education. So House Bill 1013, I did see there's a proviso for running start to the trades that I saw in this legislative cycle. I have no idea if it's going to pass, but we have been seeing quite a few things through the legislature around prep. WashDOT has preparatory funds that they award. The city of Seattle, we have some engagement with them and their priority hire program around prep. So I don't have any way of projecting where we're going to be, but it is growing. I think once we did a better job of defining what prep was, it has generated a lot more interest, and we've been able to talk about it in a healthy way because we were constantly disappointing people who wanted to make youth apprenticeship. So prep prep is really our answer for in the, you know, currently enrolled high school student space, as well as just anyone who needs to build up their skill set to be a competitive applicant and a successful apprentice.
All right, y'all. Well, I want to be mindful of time. It is 11:40 and we told you we'd keep you here till 11:30. So I thank you, Jordan, so much for all of this information.